Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Sam Coates.
And we're inviting you to our homes every Sunday to give you the lowdown on what to expect in the political week ahead.
From Politico and Sky News, this is Politics at Jack and Sam's, available every Sunday evening, wherever you get your podcasts.
What a week. A week where the unthinkable has unfolded in Israel. Civilians butchered at the hands of Hamas fighters. More Jewish people killed last Saturday than on any day since the Holocaust. And now, as we approach the weekend, Gazans face a living hell. Water, food and power supplies have already been cut to the territory, and more than 1 million Gazans have now been given 24 hours to evacuate their homes ahead of an expected ground offensive.
Each time there's been an escalation in Gaza, it seems that our colleagues and our friends there tell us this one is the worst. We never thought it could be any worse than this. And yet now we're at a state where people are really saying, I never imagined it could get to this point.
Is an evacuation order of this scale even possible? And is it legal? In a tiny, packed strip of land where roads are obstructed by rubble from bombed buildings, half the population of Gaza is being told to move south. What happens when this deadline passes? And how are these heightened tensions being felt around the world? I'm Sally Lockwood, and on this Sky News Daily, I'll be speaking to the Norwegian Refugee Council, who have 52 colleagues based in Gaza, 80% of them subject to this evacuation order. We'll also hear from our communities correspondent in the UK about the decision by Jewish schools to close as reports of anti-Semitism rise. But first, let's speak to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkall. Ali, this evacuation order is the strongest suggestion yet that a ground incursion is imminent. What are you hearing about what may unfold next?
Well, I think this sort of 24-hour window that the Israelis reportedly gave northern Gazans to leave to go down into southern Gaza, I think they're either rowing back on that or there was perhaps some misreporting overnight. But I've been with senior IDF commanders today, and I've been with people very close to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and I've asked them about this 24-hour window, and they've been very clear that it's not 24 hours, but it's move and move quickly. And what they are doing is they're monitoring the situation, presumably from aerial surveillance, to see how many people do move. That being said, whether it's 24 hours, 36 hours, in many ways is irrelevant. Because if you've got about 1.1, 1.2 million people in the northern half of Gaza, many of whom will want to, or are being asked at least, to move to the south. Where do they go? It's a very densely crowded place. That's why the UN has said that it's impossible, and it would add to what is already a very severe humanitarian crisis.
An evacuation order of this size has not been called in Gaza before, as I understand it, Ali. Do we know if this is even legal? Is this within international law?
Well, that's a difficult one, and some international lawyers will say that it's not. I think it depends on how permanent it is and how enforced it is. So some lawyers will say to you that the forcible removal, and you could argue that it is by force because, the option is go or stay and live under heavy bombardment. So you could, I think, argue that it is a forced displacement. But if it is temporary, a few days a week, then I think the Israelis will be regarded by most international community to have acted in a way that is acceptable, if I can put it like that. If it is a forced displacement for military terms that is sort of long term into the months, then yeah, I think people will say with some legal justification that they believe that it is a war crime.
Now, you've been speaking to people, as you said earlier, very close to Benjamin Netanyahu today. Once this evacuation order has been carried out, obviously we've been expecting some sort of ground incursion. What have they said to you?
Well, officially they say that no order has been given. They're very clear. The ground forces are massed and are preparing for that eventuality if that is what is decided by the war cabinet. But if you look at any conflict through history, the time between a decision being taken and the order being given can be a matter of minutes. So, it could come at any time. And I do think that the general view is that that is what will happen. I suppose the question then is, what sort of form and shape does it take? My guess, and I stress it's a guess, is that you wouldn't see the Israeli army en masse occupying Gaza City. What might happen is they might push in for a few kilometres, hold the line, and then from there project outwards using special forces to conduct specific operations in urban areas.
And what is their objective at the moment? Benjamin Netanyahu's said he wants to destroy Hamas. How realistic is that, Ali?
That is their objective, and they've made no bones about it. How realistic is it? It is realistic to destroy, if not all, certainly the majority of Hamas infrastructure, weaponry. It is realistic that they could take out a considerable number of Hamas fighters and the political leadership. What I don't think is possible is that they can remove the ideology that drives Hamas, because we've seen that play out when the British, the Americans, NATO and others have tried to do similar with Islamic State, with Al-Qaeda, with the Taliban. If anything, bombing campaigns like this only radicalize a new generation. So the military operation could be successful in achieving its objectives, and I wouldn't be surprised if it is. But unless they want to face a sort of a Hamas Mark II in 5-10 years' time, then what has to follow is a new political solution of some description, of the like that we've not seen before.
Yeah, as you say, Ali, the depressing cycle of violence seems unending as things stand right now. But of course, international allies have been, visiting Israel. They've been making their thoughts known, the most important of whom is Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's been meeting the Palestinian president in Jordan today. What hope is there, as remote as it feels right now, what hope is there of de-escalation?
Yes, so Antony Blinken was meeting Mahmoud Abbas in Amman. He was here yesterday. Actually, today the US Defense Secretary is here as well. So there's a big US diplomatic effort to try and contain this war and make sure that it doesn't escalate. Mahmoud Abbas is the Palestinian president. He's the leader of the Fatah party in Ramallah and chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He doesn't have much influence over Hamas. Hamas are a political rival. Fatah and Hamas are not friends particularly, and they back in the early 2000s, the mid 2000s, they fought a very nasty internecine battle for control of Gaza, which Hamas won. So Mahmoud Abbas is not going to have much control over what Hamas do, but he does have some limited control over the West Bank. But Mahmoud Abbas is an elderly man. Many Palestinians who live in the West Bank think that he and the people around him are corrupt, that they don't serve the people very well, that they're often too close to the Israelis. And so what we've seen in the West Bank is the growth of different militant groups, all of them vying for a little bit of slice of territory and a slice of power. But I think what the Israelis, the Americans, will be trying to say to Mahmoud Abbas is, keep control of the West Bank insofar as you can do. We do not want the West Bank going up in flames, as well as what's going on in Gaza.
And at the end of a truly terrible week, Ali, what is the feeling in Israel right now?
This is truly a national moment. The country is in national mourning. But I think maybe a week on, there will be some relief that the immediate threat seems to have been largely contained, not 100% contained. There are moments of infiltration or Hamas fighters still popping up from time to time in southern Israel. But for the most part, life feels a little bit safer here, and the rocket fire has died down a little bit. Just on that, it's unclear why. I think Israeli intelligence sources think it might be because Hamas are in a bit of disarray at the moment. They're not that well connected. They're a bit disjointed in Gaza. But also they are probably awaiting the next stage of the fight. They're probably waiting for that ground incursion if and when it happens, and then we might see another uptick of rockets fired from Gaza into Israel.
Okay, Ali, it certainly feels like it's going to be a very tense weekend ahead. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and no doubt speak to you next week. Take care. Shaina Low works with the Norwegian Refugee Council. She's based in East Jerusalem, but has a large team in Gaza, most of whom are having to evacuate. Shaina, thanks very much for joining us. Now, you've got a big team in Gaza. What are you hearing from them at the moment?
We have 52 staff based in Gaza, all Palestinian. As of this morning, thankfully, they were all accounted for. About 80% of our staff lives in the northern region of Gaza. So that's a tremendous number of just our staff who need to be seeking safer shelter. I was woken up this morning by my colleague Yusuf, based in Gaza, letting me know that he'd received notification and the call for him to flee. He was panicked. It is chaos in Gaza. There are no cars for people, or limited cars for people to move around. The roads are obstructed due to rubble and other effects of the ongoing bombardment. People cannot safely move to the center and south. I imagine that lots of people will be forced to move on foot. Even prior to this week's events, the result of more than 15 years of siege in Gaza meant that there were limited options for transportation in terms of cars and fuel. So many people are reliant on donkeys or horses. So I imagine that many will also be using those to move further south.
And of course, the number of people subject to this evacuation order is more than 1 million people. Is it even possible for 1 million people in Gaza to move to safety?
First of all, I think we have to think about there is no safe place in Gaza. Even the areas in which they are being told to leave to are under constant bombardment. On top of that, there aren't medical facilities. The majority of medical facilities in the Gaza Strip are based in the north. I saw earlier today that the World Health Organization said that forcing patients to relocate at this time would amount to a death sentence.
Now, for some experts and locals in Gaza, they're describing this as the worst humanitarian crisis that Gaza has experienced. What are your colleagues saying to you about what's happening?
Each time there's been an escalation in Gaza, it seems that our colleagues and our friends there tell us this one is the worst. We never thought it could be any worse than this. And yet now we're at a state where people are really saying, I never imagined it could get to this point. I never could imagine that, the center of Gaza City would be leveled. This really is unprecedented in terms of the amount of leveling and the amount of destruction that we're seeing, and in such a short period of time.
Many people in Gaza have already lost their homes this week in the bombardments. How much more chaos is that adding to the situation in Gaza, that now there aren't just displaced people, there are people who have nowhere to live?
My colleague told me this week and said that, there's no family that's alone in their apartment right now. People are hosting other people. We're also hearing of people who fled their homes seeking safer shelter and then were subsequently killed in the places that they'd sought refuge. You also have to remember that for the last few days, Gaza has had no electricity supply. And so it's basically a blackout there with very limited supply of fuel for generators. And so that also is breeding chaos. There aren't communication systems in place for people to be able to stay in touch with each other. It's difficult for people to even have the ability to make phone calls, to coordinate where they're going, who they're with, if their family is okay.
And what's been the response among Palestinians that you know and work with to Hamas? What support is there for Hamas that you're gauging? And how do they feel about the barbaric attacks that were carried out last Saturday?
I think people are shocked. People are shocked. We as humanitarians, and that includes my Palestinian colleagues, we don't want any civilian loss of life here. And I think but I think at the same time, asking, for example, colleagues in Gaza to be condemning this, they're busy right now. They are trying to escape for their lives with their families. They are shocked at what's happened, but at the same time, they do not have the capacity to think about anything other than how they're going to get their families to safety, how they're going to keep their kids safe, how they're going to give food to their children. That's what people are focused on right now.
We're going to take a pause now, but when we come back, we'll be joined by our communities correspondent, Becky Johnson, who's been speaking to Jewish and Muslim communities in the UK amid rising tensions. Since the attack by Hamas on Israel a week ago, the Metropolitan Police say it's seen a massive increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. Becky Johnson, our communities correspondent, has been looking at the tensions here in Britain this week. Becky, now your line isn't great. I know you're sheltering from the rain. But the awful scenes that unfolded this week in Israel and Gaza have resulted in heightened tensions among communities here too. What's going on and how are those tensions being felt and seen?
I've spent some time in North London this week where there's a very large Jewish community. And the sense that I have got from people is that they are incredibly anxious. We saw the CST, that's the charity that supports UK Jews with security, reporting a 400% increase in incidents of anti-Semitism this week compared with the same week last year. And people are nervous. People are worried about sending their children to school. I was at a Jewish school yesterday, and the head teacher was saying that any pupils that would ordinarily travel in on public transport are now coming in on taxis. He'd had some parents saying they wanted to withhold their children from school. He was having to work with parents to try to reassure them that they had stepped up security around the school, that he felt it was a safe place for children to be. But he also said that he had been working, and people within the community had been working with the local Muslim community, because of course these communities live side by side in large parts of the UK, and leaders know each other, and leaders are very keen to try to reduce any tension. Jewish people are receiving horrendous news, pictures from family and friends in Israel. Likewise, British Muslims receiving awful news and images from suffering in Gaza. And that does make people feel very emotional. It does make people feel very angry. And we know there are community leaders around the country working very closely together to try to ensure that that doesn't end up being played out on the streets of Britain.
We've seen these really upsetting, awful scenes play out in the Middle East, but it's also a very depressing development that schools in North London have felt that they have to close in the UK in 2023 due to safety issues. Is that because there have been specific threats, Becky, or is that just due to a general sense of safety now among the Jewish community?
Today in particular, there had been concern about calls for a day of rage in support of Hamas. There were concerns that there could have been protests. So although the Jewish schools that did decide to close today did say very clearly that it wasn't as a result of any specific threat against those particular school sites, they just clearly felt that it was safer for children to be at home. And they did also reiterate to families that they thought that children should remain indoors. The vast majority of Jewish schools, it should be said, have opened. Jewish schools do have security, most of them anyway. I was speaking to a security firm in London yesterday. They've had 30% increase in calls from members of the Jewish community for extra protection at sites such as schools, such as synagogues. So we know that people are feeling anxious, and their response to concerns about a reported rise in anti-Semitism is to increase security, just to try to allay the fears that people do have about being out and about on the streets.
School children have also been urged to disguise their uniforms to protect themselves going to school. Tell us more about that.
Yes, some Jewish schools have suggested that children shouldn't be out and about in the community travelling to and from school with the emblem of the school on display, for example, so that they couldn't be identified as being a pupil at that school. And we did hear from one parent yesterday who pointed out how desperately sad that is, and that his child was having to do that in Britain in 2023. And it is a sign of what's going on in the world and the repercussions that that is having.
Hugely worrying for so many Jewish families. Anti-Semitic offences, according to the Metropolitan Police, Becky, have increased a lot in the last week. What sort of offences have we been seeing?
Certainly the CST, that's the charity that supports UK Jews, have reported a relatively small number of attacks, some vandalism, the majority antisocial incidents that they're reporting. It's sort of increasing the numbers of incidents that we're seeing. And of course, we know that yesterday the government announced an extra £3 million to support the Jewish community with their security. I think that we should point out at this point that I'm actually today here in Birmingham. I'm just outside Green Lane Mosque. We were invited in to Friday prayers to speak to members of the British Muslim community here in Birmingham. And some of them were saying that they actually too feel less safe out in Britain. They were pointing out that attacks on British Muslims still happen. They're concerned that they too might rise as a result of what's going on in the Middle East. So for them, life on the streets also feels a little less safe.
Has there been evidence of an increase in Islamophobic incidents since last Saturday?
I haven't seen any data that would suggest that, but speaking to the Muslim community here at the mosque, it's something that they live with on a daily basis, they say, discrimination, and they are worried. There was a collection taking place for the victims of Gaza. Many people in the mosque know people who are currently in Gaza. One woman showed me some awfully sad pictures on her phone that she'd been sent by people that she knows there. And they feel, rightly or wrongly, I think we should say, but they feel over decades, the world has become desensitized to the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. And they feel that somehow the suffering of the people in Gaza isn't being reported, given the same column inches, if you like, as the suffering of the people in Israel. Now, as I say, that's their opinion on how this is playing out. But when I spoke to them about those calls that I was mentioning about a day of rage, pro-Poland, they were really keen to say to me that they felt that there was absolutely no place for anti-Semitism, that no one should be acting out on the strong emotions that they're feeling here in Britain. And they said that they too have empathy with the victims in Israel just as much as the victims in Gaza.
Well, that's it for this episode on the Sky News Daily, on what's been a distressing and traumatic week for so many. Take care of yourselves. I'll be back with you on Monday.
Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Sam Coates.
And we're inviting you to our homes every Sunday to give you the lowdown on what to expect in the political week ahead.
Westminster Politics is all about getting ahead of the game, so that's what we're going to try and bring you, an essential briefing packed with all the information you need to start the week.
From Politico and Sky News, this is Politics at Jack and Sam's, available every Sunday evening wherever you get your podcasts.